We're getting started here tonight with a topic of digital portfolios for learning. And this is a topic, there's not a badge in the course for this one, but it does tie into many of the other badges. And so I'll talk about that a little bit later. So as we get into the topic of digital portfolios, I want to start right away with, before I even have much of an introduction here, with how do you design a portfolio plan? Um, so a portfolio is an approach to assessment that shows growth over time using a collection of student work. That's a common definition that we use for portfolio-based assessment. So we're looking at a collection of actual student work, and generally we're looking at its progress over time. So we can see student progress by looking at one piece of work at a given date and another piece of work later. And then a digital portfolio would simply be moving that into some kind of digital context or digital environment. So when we go about designing a portfolio plan, there are really just a series of questions that we can ask, similar to like when we're designing a lesson plan, or for those of you that have a background in instructional design, we often go through a series of questions. Well, these are the questions that one can answer when they're thinking about creating a plan for portfolio assessment. The first one is simply, well, what's going to be collected? What types of artifacts are possible for one to use to verify or demonstrate or document what they've learned? Secondly, who's going to do the collecting? Now, in most cases, when we read the literature about portfolios for learning, one of the arguments for portfolios for learning is that the students are more engaged in the process, so they're the ones who are collecting it. But that's not necessarily required. Just when we look at the definition of a portfolio for learning, it can be collected by any number of people. How is it collected and where is it collected? So that's another question that has to be answered. That's one that we're not going to get into a great deal here because I'm very leery of promoting specific products, but I will talk about some that are freely available for portfolio assessment. There are a number of very robust portfolio products, and for some of you, if you use them, you're welcome to share them in the chat with one another. But I try not to make these too heavy on promoting specific products or services or one over another. When it comes to portfolios, I'm not sure that there's one clear leader that everyone should use over another one. But it is an important question when we think about, well, how do they actually collect these artifacts? Where do they collect them? That is an important factor here. In fact, one of the things we know from portfolio assessment initiatives in school districts, especially in the K-12 world, across the United States and elsewhere, is that this is often a very time-consuming initiative. And while we have a number of points we can look at that are positive about portfolios, there's little question that they're pretty time-consuming, and that usually teachers report having to spend more time than they did in previous assessment models and plans. So looking at how it's collected and where it's collected becomes really important as people think about what's feasible, what's reasonable for their audience. Next, who looks at the portfolio? So as students might collect the work, well, the student looks at it themselves, what other stakeholders outside of the learning organization, sort of mentors or people out in the world beyond the school that are involved in giving feedback on the artifacts? Is it the teacher? Are peers looking at it? All of that's part of the plan, deciding what's a good fit for your context. Also, how do they look at it? When they look at it, are they giving feedback? Are they evaluating it? Are they just being curious and asking lots of good questions to be a sort of mirror for the learner? All of those are pretty important. The next one then is what do they do with what they see? So again, I'll talk about this a little bit later, but when we look at the research, we find that many people use portfolios for some kind of evaluative process. And so when the teacher is looking at the portfolio, are they grading it using a traditional grading system? Are they using some kind of rubric that's pretty evaluative and summative in nature? Are they giving mostly formative feedback? In some cases, are they simply writing a narrative and sort of documenting what they see, what they observe, making it a little bit more neutral? So there are lots of different options. In fact, that's where the other modules in this portfolio, or in this MOOC, can become really helpful when we think about portfolios. I would argue that pretty much every module in this course could be used to support a digital portfolio plan. Peer assessment, self-assessment, assessment as learning, formative and summative assessment, digital badges for learning, and so forth. And I'll actually share a little vision a bit later. So these are some of the items that we've looked at so far in terms of assessment plans. So peer assessment, as we look at digital portfolios, is often commonplace when we look at portfolio plans at different schools. Oftentimes learners are getting feedback on their work from peers. They're workshopping their writing or their art or whatever other artifacts they're adding, and they're getting some feedback from learners. The learners are being trained on that. You can look into peer assessment more in the course if you're interested. Of course, there's self-assessment. This is a big part of the portfolio where the learners are actually thinking and reflecting about their own learning and about in evaluating their own work. There's assessment as learning, where the learners are learning about learning, right? This is probably one of the models for assessment where students are most engaged in the assessment process when we're using a digital portfolio. In fact, in many cases, the learners are driving the assessment process. Authentic assessment. Oftentimes, digital portfolios allow learners to include more authentic artifacts, artifacts that have some kind of relevance and significance beyond a given class period. So for example, portfolios can include less authentic artifacts, like a worksheet of how one did on a series of math problems or a traditional math test. But it might also include some kind of artifact from using math in a more real-world environment. And they might have something written up about what they did and how they used math in that real-world environment. But it allows students to give that kind of narrative, sort of storytelling of their learning experience. Formative assessment is a big part because usually learners with digital portfolios, they're collecting their work, they're evaluating it, they're refining it, getting more feedback, refining it further until they think it's ready to go into their portfolio. Narrative assessment, as I've mentioned before, can be a big part of portfolio assessment as one is writing up their own personal narratives, assessments of their own work. Peers may be writing up narrative assessments. Teachers may be writing up narrative assessments. Even mentors and people outside of the class can be writing narrative feedback. And a learner could actually include an artifact and those narrative assessments, and then they can write a written reflection about it. Digital portfolios can also be competency-based or standards-based. There are many instances where a school or learning organization has a set of standards or perhaps program-level outcomes, and the learner has to build a portfolio of work that's related to each of those standards or each of those program-level outcomes or each of the competencies. So in essence, at some point in the program, the learners have to demonstrate how they've met each of those program level outcomes. Even digital badges can be used for portfolios, and I've seen fewer examples of this, but a learner could actually have a badge, and attached to that badge could be an artifact, and then they could have a written reflection about what they learned by earning that badge and maybe how it aligns to a given standard or something like that. So this is the reason that I didn't actually create a separate badge for digital portfolios. It's because digital portfolios are an approach to involving students in the assessment process that can really leverage every single type of assessment that's been discussed in this course. So I think of it more as a framework. It's kind of a bigger picture than any of these individual items of assessment or approaches to assessment that I have listed here on the screen. So basics, I love this phrase. When we're talking about portfolio assessment, what are students actually doing? They're collecting, they're selecting, and they're reflecting. So the first part of a portfolio process for a student is, well, what items? They begin to kind of gather up their work and sort of they collect the things that they've been developing. And they do this in an ongoing way, perhaps, as they're going through a given course or throughout an entire program. They're continuing collecting artifacts. And then usually with the portfolio process, at some point the students, they develop some criteria for selecting from that larger body of artifacts. So they look at all of them and they select the ones that they believe most effectively represent what they have learned. So the learners are going through and they're evaluating their own work. They're going through this collection of work and they're picking out the ones that they think really speak in a significant way to how they've grown, how they've developed, how they've worked. Perhaps they pull from the collection one artifact from early on and another artifact from later, and they put those two side by side in the portfolio, and they describe how the first one shows where they started and the second one shows where they've developed. Um, so that can be pretty powerful. And also, as part of the selection process, once they've selected these items, they engage in some critical reflection of their own work. Now, this can be in writing. Usually in a portfolio, learners are expected to not only include an artifact, but include some kind of written piece that reflects on what they've learned from that artifact, what that artifact says about their learning and their progress. Also, and this is a really rich part of many digital portfolio for learning plans, is the learner has multiple opportunities, but at least one, to talk about their artifacts in their portfolio and to communicate them or present their work to another audience. It could be to a group of peers, it could be to the teacher or multiple teachers, it could be, again, to an audience outside of the school altogether. And then the audience asks them questions. So they reflect out loud, and the audience kind of helps them reflect on their work. That can be pretty powerful. And oftentimes the artifacts are categorized by certain themes, goals, standards, or objectives. Let me stop for a moment and just get some kind of response from you at this point. Does this make sense? Does this seem to be kind of a pretty clear, straightforward introduction of what we mean by digital portfolios? Do you have any questions that come to mind right away? Yeah, that makes sense, Michelle, Aaron, Teresa. So understanding the scope of the learning, so you don't just have a scrapbook, right? That it has some kind of direction. Um, I like to think of a digital portfolio as telling a story. So one way that we can sometimes approach this is asking the students, or making it clear as you have some kind of digital portfolio plan, what kind of story are the learners expected to tell in their portfolio? And maybe you set some parameters for that story. And what's the nature of the story? What are sort of the non-negotiable aspects of that story? And to what extent do the learners have flexibility and freedom in how they tell this story of their learning? Now, I can gravitate toward the idea of a digital portfolio as story because I'm first and foremost a qualitative researcher. That's what I do. Most of the work that I do in various areas comes from ethnographic research and case study research, and in many of those, we're telling a story. Well, I think about the same thing when we look at a portfolio. It's helping learners tell a story with actual artifacts. And that's why the reflective piece is so significant. It's not just a scrapbook of pieces. The learners are expected to sort of weave those together into a narrative, into a story. And that's where their written reflections or their oral reflections help do that. Think of it also even as a tour. You imagine you went on a world tour and traveled to many different countries, and then you came back and you gave a slideshow of your trip. And as you gave the slideshow, you took people through these photographs, and each photograph was sort of an artifact that represented something that you did and something that you experienced. And as you're talking to the audience about your trip, you tell them about sort of what you experienced and what you learned maybe from that place. And you give them some kind of insight into it. That's the exact same thing we're talking about with a digital portfolio, is that they're building a story, they're telling a story, they're taking people on a journey of their learning. Now, when we think about the types of artifacts that one can include, this is certainly not an exhaustive list. There are many other items that one could include as well in terms of a digital portfolio. You can include more traditional assessments like tests and quizzes. And I've seen many examples where people do that, but all forms of writing are possible. Essays and journal entries and poetry, written correspondence with other people. There's so different kinds of letter writing, um, blog entries that people might have gathered. Maybe people are engaging in blended or online learning and they have threaded discussions where they're interacting with one another in a discussion board. They might pull out portions of their discussion board posts and interactions with others and use that as an artifact. So many forms of writing. Um, Also, assessments. So perhaps one engaged in some kind of performance or some kind of activity, and they got feedback from another person in a written or oral form through a checklist or a rubric. They might include those artifacts in the portfolio as well and include a written reflection about what they say. I'm a really big advocate of also extending the artifacts into the visual and the multimedia sphere. And that's where we can think about artifacts like photo essays or videos and podcasts or audio podcasts where there's some kind of recording of a learner engaging in a particular activity, or there's an image that represents what they did or that demonstrates where they were, or maybe some real life experience they had. I see photo essays for service learning projects oftentimes. But in addition, for example, with a photo essay, not only do they have the photo, but they have some written narrative that sort of ties the different images together. They're often sort of these maybe 1 to 3 sentence descriptions, sometimes a paragraph or so for each image. And they also tell a story about a specific, more narrow learning journey. They can include things like reference letters or video or audio comments or interviews from other people about the learner and about their learning and their progress. It's more a secondary artifact, but it can be pretty enlightening and interesting. Drawings or other artistic expression could be included. The use of mind maps and down here notes and logs of work and lab reports. These sort of rough draft artifacts can also be used oftentimes. They're very powerful ways of showing progress. So a learner might include some of these elements as demonstrating an early stage of learning and then a more refined artifact later on. And that can make for a powerful piece. Those of you who've worked with digital portfolios, can you think of some other items that I might be missing, or anyone in the room? Now, what are some other possible artifacts that come to mind that you might want to include in a portfolio that demonstrates your learning? Oh, Deborah, an infographic. Yeah, that's a great idea. Um, so an infographic, they're becoming increasingly popular. They got popular the last few years, especially. I think Pinterest made them become even more popular as people found this way to sort of share images quickly and easily with one another. But an infographic that has sort of a visual representation of knowledge or data. In fact, there are a number of websites where people can create their resumes in an infographic format. And so that could be a really interesting artifact to include. Other ideas? No worries, Beth. Welcome. Awards. So that's an interesting one. And we could maybe throw in the word badges too. So some kind of award or certificates or artifacts that demonstrate some kind of measurable accomplishment. So awards, certificates, badges, like maybe someone went through first aid training and they have credentials from that first aid training. So they could include some of those artifacts Now, it depends upon the way you set up your portfolio. These are all sort of secondary pieces, right? So a primary artifact or would be one that shows us the actual work that the student did. Now, a badge or an award, that signifies an accomplishment, but you don't actually see the accomplishment or the work itself. In some cases, there's a way to get back at that primary. In other times, you can include kind of a mix of primary and secondary pieces. So yes, awards, badges, certificates, all of those are a possibility. Um, it really depends on how you choose to set up the portfolio and what you choose to allow or not allow. And usually it's a good idea to go through exercises with the learners where maybe you have these two columns and what makes for a good artifact and what makes for a not so good or less effective artifact. I see a couple of people typing. Goals. That's also something that shows up in portfolios. That's a great point, and I'll get to that in a little bit. So sometimes portfolios can include learner goals. So you may have standards or program level goals that need to be met, but you can also have the learners including some of their own personal goals and aspirations as they relate to the content or even more broadly, just about their own learning. And that's something we'll often see in portfolios. Feedback from a supervisor or yes, for a teaching practicum. Reflection tags. Heather, can you tell me a little more what you mean by that? I'm not familiar with the phrase reflection tag. Oh, I see. Okay. Yeah. So any kind of reflection that they add to kind of reflect on the work that they're including in their portfolio. Absolutely. Great. So there are any number of artifacts that can be included. This is just a beginning, and the learners, as they engage in this activity, will often come up with different ideas. So when we think about this, here are some of the affordances or the benefits that I see of a portfolio process, and these are the affordances, the benefits that you'll see in the literature that are often talked about. So one is, and this is one we've been talking about in many ways in past webinars as well, which is that students are engaged in the assessment process. It's not an assessment that's done to them as much as students are actively engaged. They're participants in the assessment process. So along with that, students are able to develop some pretty significant self-assessment skills. They develop those metacognitive skills, and so assessment as learning becomes a big part of this. That's a powerful affordance. They also can provide snapshots of learning across time in a wonderful way. So when you think about a letter grade gives us sort of a final grade in a course. But a portfolio goes into a deeper, richer description that allows you to see where one was at different stages of the course and of the process. So for example, when you looked at two learners' portfolios who are in an advanced writing class, you could see that one learner came into the class with really strong writing skills. Whereas, and at the end, they maintained those strong writing skills and they progressed a little bit. But you may see another learner who came in and they had some significant challenges with their writing. But by the end, you can see how they really expanded and developed much further than where they started. So it allows you to do these relative comparisons. You're comparing a students to themselves across time. That can be a wonderful way also for differentiation of instruction or more personalized learning plans. So depending upon where a student comes in to a class, like what their background knowledge is and their expertise, how much that really impacts how much they're going to be able to master or how much they're going to be able to learn over a given course or maybe even a given program in some cases. There's some things that just take more time. And And the portfolios, giving us this snapshot across time, can give us a better and clearer, more accurate picture of what's happening. Another piece that many point to is that portfolios have the benefit of including lots of authentic artifacts. So while you can include artifacts like tests and quizzes and more traditional assessments, you can also include some artifacts that give evidence of one's ability to use that knowledge a in a real world setting or context, which is what we want. We all know that in learning environments, one of our biggest challenges is the challenge of transfer, right? We try to teach for transfer. The problem with tests and quizzes is that they haven't been shown to be highly effective in many cases to help people transfer their knowledge to a new context. I heard the story once of a professor who was trying to teach a basic physics concept. And so, in order to do it, the professor took an object um, and let me see, I have to remember how this story goes. So the professor takes an object and he holds it up and he has the students. Oh shoot, I forgot I apologize. I'm stumbling here because I forgot the punchline to the story, and it's not going to be very interesting to you unless I can remember it. So I guess I'll hold off on it, see if it comes to me a little bit later. Sorry about that. But I'll just give a different example quickly for transfer. So in terms of transfer, one of the problems we may have, for example, is imagine a program where we're training people to become teachers. And they're going through a series of courses at university. And they learn a number of things over their freshman and their sophomore and their junior year. Maybe they take a class on classroom management and they memorize a lot of the models and the approaches to managing a classroom effectively. And then at some point they step into a classroom. Now the question is, did that background knowledge equip them to be able to use it in a real world circumstance in that moment? And the answer is almost always no. There's a significant difference between knowing about this and being able to apply it in a new context. And then once you can apply that in a context, say with a group of third graders, what happens when you have a group of eighth graders or a group of fifth graders or even a different group of learners? So transferring your knowledge from one context to another context to another context can be a real challenge. And many times the assessments that we use in our classes don't help learners figure out how to transfer. They don't help them to develop transferable skills. Well, it is possible in a portfolio approach for you to have learners create artifacts that demonstrate their knowledge in different contexts. So they have to demonstrate this ability to transfer their knowledge in many different settings. And those kinds of authentic artifacts can be pretty powerful. The next one is the next affordance is that they can provide a rich description of student work. And this ties back to what I mentioned before about stories and storytelling. When we have a numeric assessment of a learner, it's hard to tell sometimes what that actually means. And in many cases, we get some kind of number or score on a test. And if we look more closely, we can get a picture of what they got correct and what they got incorrect. But the number itself doesn't tell us much about that. And even then, when we look at the individual pieces, we don't know exactly why they got it correct or incorrect. And yet with a portfolio, we can get into that. We can actually have the learners provide a rich description of what they were thinking when they created this product and what they learned from it. And things can become much clearer, much more transparent when we look at this. Let me just stop and see if you have any questions about the affordances, or maybe you have other benefits or affordances that you want to share that you've seen with portfolios. I see Deborah's typing, so I'll wait just a moment. As Deborah types, I remembered my example, my story from a few moments ago, so I'll share it. And this was about that issue of transfer. So the professor is teaching a basic physics concept, and he decides to climb up on top of a ladder in the class, and he holds two objects. They're two objects that are of an equal, or two objects of different weights, but sort of the same mass. And he holds them up and he says, so when I drop these two objects, which one will hit the ground first? And the answer, of course, is they're both going to hit the ground at the exact same time. And the students predict, and he lets go of the objects, and they both hit the ground at the same time, and the students discover this wonderful lesson, and this wonderful simple physics lesson. So then on the test, the professor gives a story problem that's very similar to the situation that he set up in class. Instead of, however, him climbing up on a ladder and dropping the two objects, he instead describes a scenario where you have a hole and you drop the two objects. Which one hits the bottom of the hole first? And to his dismay, a huge number of the learners in the class got the question incorrect. One student at the end of the class came up to the professor irate and looked at him in the eyes and said, this was completely unfair. And the teacher said, no, I told you about it. Remember, I climbed up on the ladder and I let go of the two objects. And they both hit the ground at the same time. And the student said, no, you taught us ladders, not holes. So you get the idea, is that it was the same concept, but it was applied in a slightly different context. And that's the problem that we have oftentimes with transfer issues. Learners are much more concrete, and it's much more tied to a given context when they learn it. In fact, we even know from some research that when you're trying to recall something from memory, that it's easier to recall certain things when you can sort of conjure a similar emotion to what you had when you first recalled it, which always leads me to wonder about that teacher who uses a lot of threats to keep students on task. And the students are always a bit anxious and nervous and scared in class. If that means that the learner later on in life is going to have to get scared or anxious to recall what they learned in that class. I'm not sure if there's any research to actually indicate that that's exactly true, although I think there have actually been some studies about like military training where they have to equip military personnel to have military-like circumstances where they practice certain skills so that they can recall them and they can apply them in a similar intense circumstance. Now let me take a moment and go back and look at the posts. Deborah wrote, students learn to articulate their learning, and once they have done it in writing, they can articulate them much better verbally. That makes great sense, and there's a lot of great research to talk about the value of writing and how it teaches one to be more articulate and thoughtful and intentional in their word choice, how it helps one to cultivate verbal skills as well. Beth, the importance of directing student attention to the salient facts, yes. Oh, no worries, Gail. Comment is on point number 2. You love using your portfolios during the student-parent-teacher conferences where students lead the conferences. The reflecting of self-assessing the students are learning to do really surprises their parents. And that's a point we talked about in just a couple of slides ago too. So I'm so glad you reinforced that, Gail, with an actual example from using them, where the learners are having to reflect about their work, either in writing or orally or both. And those student-led conferences, I know, are becoming quite popular in many environments, especially environments where people are using a portfolio assessment. So what about the challenges for portfolio assessments then? Well, one of the questions that comes up, especially today in the United States, we have this, and I'm sure that people have it in other parts of the world as well. But people are asking this question about how do they fit with standardized tests? Do they prepare the learner for these big tests that we have to have? And that's a question that people pose, and it's a challenge that people pose. Is there room for portfolio assessment along that kind of teaching to the test mindset that sometimes develops in certain schools or districts or contexts? And that's just a reality today as we think about about portfolio assessment. A second one has to do with the consistency of grading by different teachers. From a research perspective, part of this is what we call inter-rater reliability. And so a challenge can be, well, and we've actually found this in research as we looked at portfolio assessments, is that many times one teacher will sort of evaluate a portfolio in a certain way. It might be considered exemplary, and another teacher might rate it as developing. And in order to get past that and to have more inter-rater reliability, that means making it a more formal process, having much clearer expectations, clear rubrics that sort of measure what has and hasn't been included. And that's a real challenge. Now, the reality, though, is there any inter-rater reliability with using traditional letter grades? And there have been plenty of studies to indicate that letter grades are a problem in that regard as well. I'm just scanning the comments on the side momentarily to see if there's anything I need to comment on. So Heather wrote, why are portfolios graded? They should be reflection. And that's certainly the perspective that many people would make about portfolios. And actually, I'll mention some research later on that would support your claim. But in some contexts, portfolios are a collection of graded work, or they are, many of the artifacts are graded work. So it's kind of a weaving of graded and ungraded artifacts. But in some places, the portfolio itself, that's actually used to verify whether or not students have met certain criteria as they relate to certain course level goals, program level goals or outcomes, something like that. So in that sense, they're graded or evaluated. That doesn't necessarily mean that a letter grade is being used. But also the learner is sometimes doing the grading of their own work. Beth wrote, I mean the quality of the self-analysis. Did the student really reflect or just scrawl something on the shallow quality? So yeah, I agree with the comments that reflection is powerful. Just as we've talked many times, that formative feedback is one of the most important elements when we talk about assessment. When it comes to actual learning, we know that formative feedback is one of the keys. And reflection can be a form of sort of formative feedback, right? Self-generated formative feedback. Heather, we'll talk a little bit about the different kind of approaches here to a grade. Do keep in mind that when I say grade, I don't always mean letter grade. We could use assess or evaluate or some kind of measure, but there is oftentimes a measure that's applied when people use these. The next one is, what do the scores mean? So in many portfolio approaches, when the people have studied them, there's some kind of score that's used, and it could be a rubric that's demonstrating some kind of like they're developing or they're demonstrating competence. Sometimes this is something the learner uses as a self-assessment. But there's a question as to whether or not these are valid, and do they really say what we think they say? So if a learner includes a given artifact and then they reflect that this artifact demonstrates that I know how to do fill in the blank, the question is, does it really demonstrate that? And that's a question that some people have about portfolios. Another challenge is that teacher training on how to assess different types of artifacts when the artifacts are used as part of the assessment process, that requires a great deal of time. And so as you look at the research on portfolio assessment, that's one of the critiques that people have, is it's a very time intensive, it requires significant resources. Having a wonderful conversation on the side there. I'll just let it continue. So let's get into some examples. So what does a portfolio look like? Well, it can look like all sorts of things. A portfolio could simply be a Microsoft Word document, or choose your favorite word processor. It could be a PowerPoint where they've embedded different artifacts, or it could be a a folder on Google Docs or Google Drive where they link to different things. They could use a wiki or a blog online, or they could use any one of a number of portfolio packages. Um, but it might look like something simple like this in terms of the home page of a digital portfolio. So you might see some kind of personal information, like in a profile where there's a little background, a person's past and credentials and interests, maybe a place for the person to include some of their own personal learning goals and aspirations, some awards, a brief introduction to the portfolio and what it might say. And then on the other side, there might be a series of categories, and maybe these are categories that are pre-developed by a teacher, and the students are expected to include a number of artifacts within each category. Maybe each category relates to a content area or program level assessment or course level assessment, whatever it might be. This could be done on any level, unit, course, a whole program. And so you might click on these links, and then within those you would see some artifacts and then some written reflections about each of those artifacts. Yes, so Beth wrote, each one is a program outcome. Right, that makes good sense. So what's included in these circles might vary. They could be outcomes, they could be courses, they could be sort of themes or content areas. It all depends upon your own sort of portfolio assessment design, and they can be designed in many different ways. Now this one is kind of small, I apologize, but this is actually an example of a portfolio that's used for a program that I've led for a number of years, a master's degree program in educational design and technology. These learners are mostly entirely online, and they take some courses, and I'll actually show you the big picture of the portfolio plan later, but they take courses, but as they go through the program, they also have to demonstrate their learning as it relates to the 6 program level goals, or I call them themes here. These are connected to a set of standards called the National Educational Technology Standards. The first one's called Facilitating and Inspiring Learning and Creativity. The second one, Designing Learning Experiences, Environments, Resources, and Assessments. And so there's a quick introduction, and then they have a link to each theme. And then underneath it, you'll just see, by the way, that they are asked to provide artifacts, and they have to include artifacts on 3 different levels. Level 1 is, I know about it. Level 2 is, I can apply it. Level 3 is, I can conduct research or I can lead with that concept or idea. And so in this particular example, they have to include artifacts, but the structure is their artifacts have to demonstrate their progress from level 1 all the way through level 3 in each of these themes. And they can include artifacts from work within a course, but they can also include artifacts from something in their own free time, maybe a active community service or part of their work. They can actually pull things in from elsewhere. And in fact, in this instance, I actually encourage them to do that because I want evidence that they can apply the knowledge in a non-classroom context. I mean, when they're the learner, like I want to see them apply it if they're teachers in their own classrooms or their own schools or their own environments. And this becomes a wonderful sort of weaving of artifacts from more traditional coursework and from their own work, and then they include some reflections. So here's the next page. This is from theme 1, and you'll find that they have an introduction, and this is where they describe, they provide a brief introduction to this theme and sort of where they stand on that theme. And then they have some goals. Then they have their artifact, and you can click the link on it, and you'll also see a written reflection about sort of what this artifact says about their learning and their progress. And in this one, Eric, you asked, I give them a 1, 2, or 3. No, I don't give them a 1, 2, or 3. I simply verify that they have provided 1, 2, and 3 level artifacts. So in other words, early in the program, they have to submit a first draft of their portfolio. And that first draft is really just setting up the portfolio and adding a couple of level 1 artifacts. By mid-program, they start to add some level 2 artifacts, and by the end of the program, they have to add level 3 artifacts. So the students self-assess, and I simply verify that their assessment seems to be accurate. So if they don't have an artifact, a number of artifacts that reach level 3, I don't say you get a C or a D. There's nothing like that. It's just kind of a P or a pass or fail. It's a mastery approach. What I would do is say, I'm unable to, at this time, I'm unable to verify that this artifact is a level 3 artifact. Can you further explain why or how this artifact is a level 3? Or perhaps you'd like to consider using a different artifact. That's usually the way that I might word my feedback for them. So again, it's all really learner generated. The learner is doing the reflection. They are having to articulate, provide the evidence that they've met these standards, and they're articulating what and how they've learned it. Now, this is the program level picture, just to kind of give you a sense of how this is from a graduate program, but it could be used in many different contexts. Here's an example from my own program of how it works. So on the left, on the top, we have the 6 program goals. And those are really ultimately, that's what drives the entire program. The learners are going to demonstrate a growing level of depth and knowledge and ability as it relates to the 6 program goals. One of the ways that they do that is through coursework. And so they take a series of 11 classes, and within each class, the instructors have different projects and activities that the students engage in. And the students are typically able to extract from each class 2 to 4 artifacts that they can eventually include in their portfolio. And they're getting feedback from peers and from the instructor within that course on those artifacts. And then they're also going to write up their own self-reflections, and they might actually refine the artifact further. Then they do that through the entire program. Then they also they can choose a more applied project at the end or a thesis. And their actual project could be one big artifact for their portfolio, but it might actually be up to 10 artifacts. So maybe they create a number of lessons, and maybe they're doing a more applied project, and they create an entire curriculum for something in a given grade level. Well, they might have dozens of artifacts that they could pull from their capstone project. And then in addition, in the bottom left, they might have artifacts from their work that they include, things that they were creating. Maybe they led a workshop for their colleagues, and maybe they video recorded it and they included that, or they had some kind of feedback form that everyone filled out and they included that and they reflected on it. They might have done some activity things. Maybe they're on the planning committee for a seasonal event in the local community, and they use some of their knowledge or skills from this program there. They could include artifacts for that as well. Then on the right-hand side, we have the portfolio itself, where they include artifacts that have level 1, level 2, level 3, and then they also reflect about each artifact, and they include some kind of personal profile, almost like a resume. The neat thing about this is that many of the learners can actually use this portfolio then for multiple purposes. It's mainly a way for them to kind of reflect and to sort of document their growth and progress across the program. But it also turns into a portfolio that many people use as they're considering different jobs. I have a number of people in the program who've gotten excellent new jobs because of having this collection of work. Let me go back and just skim the comments and see what we have here. So Eric, I think I answered that question about what happens if they don't achieve. Beth asked, that's close to what we do when we grade the self-reflection. I didn't mean we give them a grade, but it's assessed, feedback is given. Yeah, so just you're part of the feedback process, and they get credit for eventually doing it well or not. Helpful to see how the portfolio fits within a program along with the structure. And this is a good example of where it is in a more traditional program otherwise. Right. So the other thing that I'll mention too is I've actually been dabbling with the idea of using digital badges. So one thing that I'll be having conversations with our faculty about over the next year is about the possibility of each course in the program having 2 to 5 digital badges that one can learn or one can earn in the course. and the artifact that they'll have to provide an artifact to earn that badge, sort of like the massive open online course that some of you are participating in right now. And those badges then can be plugged right into the portfolio. They'll still include a written reflection attached to it, but it might be a way to sort of use both badges and a portfolio assessment. The reason I like that is because then if they have artifacts attached to badges, the learners can actually later reorganize their portfolio for new purposes. So imagine that a learner was applying for a new job and they wanted to highlight certain skills. They could quickly kind of move things around with their badges, or they could sort of recategorize their badges. Like maybe their badges were organized by course at one point or by program level goal, but now they're applying for a job that has three main criteria. And maybe they want to reorganize their portfolio around those three criteria for the job. And they could do that by just sort of moving their badges around. I'm still sort of dabbling with the idea. I'm not entirely sold on it, but I see some promise. And Margie here says, you're teaching a course called Online Teaching and Learning, and now you award badges that relate to the INACOL standards. Yes, very good. That's great. So very quickly, I'm running out of time already. I want to have at least a minute or two for Q&A. I guess we've done a little throughout. In terms of the research, here's what we know. There's more than just this, but I'm highlighting a few things. One, we know that for digital portfolios, student attitude is essential. So students have to have a positive attitude about it. In the research, when we've looked at students who feel like this is sort of forced upon them and they do it begrudgingly, it really has no more significant gain than any other traditional assessment. The students have to really take some, have choice in the process. They need to feel a sense of ownership in it, and they need to have a sense of responsibility, that the assessment process is really not something done to them, but that they engage in order to learn and grow. And without making that culture shift, portfolio assessment doesn't seem to have that much of a positive gain for learners, because we need to have that kind of choice, ownership, and responsibility culture for learners to really be open to developing those necessary metacognitive skills, for learners to really begin to sort of investigate and discover more about their own learning in this process. And then the third piece that I'll mention comes from a really rich body of literature about portfolios that goes back, I think, even to the 80s. And one of the things that we know is that a critical element of a portfolio assessment is the reflection. So they collect, they select, and they reflect. And without the reflect part, we know that it just doesn't achieve the kinds of gains that we want to see. And related to that is the reflection is a form of storytelling. And this actually draws out of some of the kind of learning theories that have dominated since Dewey in some ways. But talking about things like constructivism and the idea that learners construct knowledge and they construct meaning. Well, the portfolio sort of resembles that, as the learners are sort of constructing this story of their own learning. And by constructing the story, they're actually learning something new. So it's an excellent way of promoting assessment as learning, where they've learned through the individual artifact, but then they sort of relearn something new as they go about collecting, selecting, and reflecting on it. So it's some promising research. There is the challenges that I mentioned before are not to be ignored. Those are critiques that are real, and they're ones that we have to face in the contemporary education system. We're certainly, this is part of a webinar and a course called Learning Beyond Letter Grades, so I'm pretty open about my own biases, but we're in a world of letter grades right now, so we want to think about how we can at least enhance or support the letter grade system, or if you're in a context where it's an option, maybe you do look for ways to replace it. So no worries, Deborah. Thanks for coming. So if you're interested, I will just share a great resource online. It's actually from Gallaudet University. I think it's a university for hearing impaired individuals. And this, if you just do a Google search for portfolios for student growth at Gallaudet University, you will find a rich collection of resources about portfolio assessment. It's one of my favorite sites on the web about portfolio assessment. Very good, practical. It's focused on K-12. It can be used in K-12 or higher ed. So that's kind of the end of my formal presentation. I know we're at 6 o'clock. I apologize for talking right to the very end, but let me just stop and feel free if you have to take off, go ahead. Otherwise, I'll stick around for a few minutes and do some Q&A.